Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. So this is the third video in a three-part series all about sex and why we should wait until marriage. So the first video was me sharing 5 reasons why as Christians we should wait. The second video was 8 practical tips on how to wait, and those videos will be linked below. And this third and final video in this series is all about my journey of losing my virginity when I was 19 and how God healed me throughout my 20s. And I want to share this story in 4 stages. It's very personal, and I'm sharing it in the hopes that it will help you and hopefully help you not feel so isolated. I especially wanted to film this video because often I don't think it's talked about enough that women also struggle with sexual temptation. It's not just men in church, it also is women. And so that's why I wanted to put this story out there to hopefully not make any women watching this feel so isolated. So let's begin in stage 1. So I like to call stage 1 my teenage years. So I was raised in the church. I was raised in a Christian home. So I knew that sex before marriage was something that you weren't meant to do. But to be honest, I didn't really know why. And it's one of my primary reasons why I actually recorded the video, why we should wait, because people said I should, but I didn't really know. And that made it difficult for me to stick to waiting before marriage because I didn't fully understand the reasons behind it. And also, for many women in the church, you experience in your youth conversations about insecurity or conversations about whether you like a guy or not. But the topic of sexual temptation and dealing with sexual temptation doesn't really come up. And so I honestly didn't even think it was a thing that women experienced, which shows how naive I was. And when I was 16, I got baptized. And I thought I was in a good place with my faith. I was like, well, I'm baptized, I'm in a good place. Looking back, I wasn't. I didn't know what it meant to apply Christian faith to real life because I'd not really gone through anything. I was only 16. And then 2 years later, I was approaching the time where I was going to be going to music college. However, when I was doing my A-level, so between the age of 16 and 18, one particular friend that I had was quite a bad influence. She would talk about masturbation and talk about men in not very nice ways. We sometimes used to play these silly games of what kind of guy we'd want to be with and what we'd want to do with the guy. And it sounds so immature. But me and my twin sister, we were both in the same friendship group. We just got dragged along in this, and it wasn't healthy. And it just shows that when you're young, I think especially for young women, when you're not taught it in youth group, you don't know it's a thing. And that was my experience. And so moving on into stage 2, which I like to call my college years. So as I mentioned, when I was 18, I went to college, and it was a music college. So it was definitely a sex, drugs, rock and roll kind of vibe. And I was in over my head, to be honest. I remember turning up and just being so surprised that these people even existed. They seemed so much more mature than me. It's like they knew so much more. And in many ways they did. They'd been experiencing the world and the culture of the world their entire lives. And I had lived in a little bit of a bubble. And I remember making friends with a guy, and we would go out and have the odd beer from time to time. I actually didn't really drink, and it was him that in a way forced me to start drinking. I remember asking for a pint of lemonade, and he brought me back a pint of beer. And I probably drank about a quarter of it and felt horrible. But because of that, I then started drinking more. And he would talk about sex a lot. And he would be very graphic in the way that he would talk about it. And I found that really confusing. And I didn't honestly know what he was talking about half the time. And I didn't have anyone that I could turn to for wisdom. And so I just went along with it. And then when I was I was probably about 18 and a bit, I'd been at college for maybe about 4 months at that point. I got in a relationship with a non-Christian guy. And the issue that I faced is that this non-Christian guy in so many ways was so lovely. He was a really nice guy in many ways, to be honest. But he was raised in a home where faith wasn't a thing and sex before marriage was a thing. And he actually had an older brother that to this day is probably one of the most disgusting people I've ever met. I know that sounds horrible, but the way that he would talk about sex and the way that he would talk about women, it's honestly like they were just animals and he just didn't care. And I was thinking, well, that's the example that this guy that I'm dating is getting. Now, I managed to stay clear of any form of sexual intimacy for probably about 6 months, but it just kept getting harder and harder. We were friends with people in our classes who were in relationships with one another, who were having sex, and people just automatically assumed that we were having sex. And it was just awkward because inside we were both like, well, we're not. And I knew that it was because of me why we weren't, that he wanted to have sex. And I remember one evening, my parents were actually on holiday and I was staying with my granddad at the time. And I was performing at a gig. And the gig wasn't really near my home. And so I was basically relying on my boyfriend's parents at the time to give me a lift to the train station so I could get home. But the gig went on a little bit longer than planned. We also got stuck in terrible traffic to the train station. And so they said, we've missed the last train. You can come back to our house and you can stay over and then go home the following day. And I remember just feeling so forced into a situation that I was not comfortable with. They didn't have a spare room. They did have obviously like a sofa down in the living room. But I felt like I couldn't say to my ex at the time, my boyfriend, now my ex, can you sleep on the sofa so I can have your bed because I'm not comfortable sharing. I was only 18 at the time. I just didn't have the confidence to do that. I didn't want to feel embarrassed. And so I ended up sharing a bed with him. And that brother that I was referring to actually came into the room and chucked a bottle of WD-40 at us and said, oh, the bed squeaks, you better apply some of that. And that's the company that I was in. And it was just so uncomfortable. And I ended up like literally, I was wearing skinny jeans. I was wearing skinny jeans under this massive quilt and I was boiling hot. But I didn't want to take any clothes off. I didn't want to put myself in any situation that made me vulnerable. But the problem was actually at the time is I was falling in love with this guy and I did want to be close with him. But I, at the beginning, just knew that it wasn't right. But sadly, as the weeks and the months went by, the temptation just grew and grew. And one thing that I always would advise against is crossing any type of border. Like you think, oh, well, if we don't have actual sex, then it doesn't matter if we touch or if we kiss. It doesn't matter if we do these things as long as we're not going the whole way. And I actually allow myself to engage in certain activities that without realizing we're just going to make it a million times harder to actually avoid actual sex. And to be honest, I was engaging in sex. It may have not been, the sex that we think about, but it was definitely edging on sexual activity. And I was just opening myself up to a world of sin, to be honest. And I was just literally felt like I was just in the middle of a desert by myself and so confused. I felt so isolated. And as I'm sure that you can probably get from where the story's going, we did have sex. And I remember finding out that, well, here's what I want to share. And this just shows two different viewpoints on what happened. After we had sex for the first time, I went into the bathroom and showered, and I honestly felt like I was washing off dirt, that I was having to wash away all this horrendous sin that I just had to open myself up to. Whereas my boyfriend at the time went into the living room where his brothers were and did this. A thumbs up. Yep, tick. I've now had sex. And I remember when he told me that, feeling like a piece of meat, feeling like it doesn't matter who I was as long as he's had sex. And at that point, when we actually did have sex, I was 19 at the time. And obviously the sexual relationship continued. And looking back at the time, I'd be lying if I said that I didn't enjoy sex. But like I talked about in the part 1 of this series, is that it was all about my own sexual gratification and the fun and the pleasure of it. It wasn't for the right reasons. And this actually made it very difficult when as I mentioned in the first video, when I did get married, my viewpoint was just in the complete wrong place. But moving back to the story of when I was 19, the relationship continued. And when I was 20, me and my boyfriend at the time were going into university. And for some reason, I thought that it was a good idea that we lived together, which was so silly. We actually had a friend of mine join us. I think that made me feel less guilty knowing that there was someone else in the house, which was ridiculous. But we moved in together, and I would say that it's when we moved in together that I realised that I was just in this mess. I was starting to experience depression, and I was aware that I was opening myself up to this world that I was not prepared to live. I didn't want to live in that world. I wanted something different. And we'd been together about 2 years when I told him that I wanted to end the relationship. And honestly, this was so difficult for me, equally for him. But I know for me that it was so difficult because I did at the time love him. I really cared for him. I shared so much with him. But I knew that it was the right thing to do. And it was very difficult. I actually faced quite a lot of bullying from ending that relationship, and it wasn't easy. But I would never go back and change the decision that I made. But I want to now move on to stage 3, which is all about the time in my 20s before I met my husband when I was 27. So from the age of 20 to about the age, I'd say, of 26 to 27, I left that relationship. And for the first few months or so, I felt quite liberated, to be honest. I felt very hurt and I was struggling because I had left a relationship that did mean something to me. However, I had this liberation of, I'm not living in sin anymore. And it was very freeing. But because I'd opened myself up to sexual temptation and to the act of sex, I caught myself in this rapid of sin, of sexual temptation, where I struggled with so many different things. I never watched pornography. That's something that I will say. I never have watched pornography, but I definitely struggled massively with lust. I'd gone from experiencing what sex was like to being by myself, and I didn't really date anyone from the age of 20 to 25. Then when I was 25, I was in a brief relationship with someone for a few months. I didn't really go anywhere. And then when I was 27, I met my husband. And so for me, like, I was just opening myself up to this world of sinful behavior. Even though I wasn't in that relationship anymore, I was engaging in certain sinful acts that were not good for me. And I struggled for many, many years. I struggled with so much temptation. If I ever liked a guy, my immediate thought would be, what would it be like having sex with that guy? And that was so unhealthy. And actually, one of the reasons why I knew my husband was different is because when I actually met him, that isn't the first thought that crossed my mind, even though I was very attracted to him. But I had to overcome this battle for many years. And honestly, it felt like the enemy just had control. And this is why I think I really advocate for people not to have sex before marriage, because you then face, even if you step away from it, you're faced with so much baggage that has been brought on because of those acts that you've engaged in. And for me, that was what I was journeying. And as I mentioned in last week's video, I did put things into place which did help me. So, like, if I got bored, that often was when thoughts would start coming to my mind. And so I would try and find ways to stop myself from being bored. But it wasn't easy. And to be honest, I didn't tell that many people what I was going through. Even my own twin sister, for a long time I didn't share with her, and she's someone that I pretty much share most things with. And the reason why is because it wasn't talked about. It never seems to be talked about that women struggle with things like masturbation, with pornography. It's not talked about. So then if you are a woman who struggles with those things, you feel a million times worse than probably in a way the guys feel, because at least they seem to be understood that it's something that most men go through. Whereas I never had a conversation with any friend who was experiencing what I was going through. And I think it's because they probably felt like they couldn't share. Like, I'm sure many of the women in my life that I've been friends with have struggled with similar things. But even to this day, I've not talked to them about it. And this is what I think we need to change. For youth groups to talk to girls about sexual temptation, about masturbation, about pornography, about lust, it needs to be talked about, obviously at the correct age, not too early. Because I think when it comes to puberty and everything like that, women do tend to start a bit later, I think, than men. And so obviously the temptation may come at a different age. So you need to be sensible when you talk about it. At least that was my case. You know, I didn't really hit puberty till I was about 15. I know some women it's earlier, and so it's all dependent on that. And so again, some men start early, some men start puberty late. So it's all dependent on your age. But we need to be sensible when we talk about it. But we need to talk about it. And so, as I say, I didn't talk to anyone about it. And I honestly had to overcome that addiction by myself. And as I say those words, it's making me feel quite upset to think that I didn't have anyone that I felt like I could talk to. And I'm sure there were people out there who would have been really understanding. But when it was at its worst, I didn't tell anyone. And honestly, it was crying out to God that allowed me to have healing. It was saying to God, I'm sick and tired of this addiction. I remember when it was at its worst, feeling like the enemy was just in me, taking over. I remember screaming out, get out, get out. You are not in control of my life. God is. And I would encourage you, if you are going through struggles with temptation like masturbation, pornography, whatever it is, to cry out to God, to scream out and ask for God to come in and ask for the enemy to go out. Because we are living in a world where the enemy is taking over. And I would say that one of the biggest ways the enemy is taking over our society and our culture today is through sex. And so we need to stop pretending that it's not a big thing, because it is. It's a huge thing that we need to deal with. And so I am very thankful to say that I did, for the most part, overcome that addiction before I met my husband. When I met my husband, my mindset was in a much better place. As I mentioned, I didn't automatically just think of us having sex together. I thought about the friendship that we had and what it could be. You know, my mind was in a much purer place. But I still did struggle from time to time. But I think now that I was with my husband, and I'd say this is stage 4 of when I met my husband, knowing that I was with someone did motivate me to deal with my struggles, because I knew that it wasn't just me. And this is why I have talked about in the previous videos the importance of thinking about your spouse before you even date anyone. I didn't do that, and I think if I would have done, it may have helped. And it wasn't until I actually started dating my future spouse that I actually was like, actually, this isn't just about me. It's going to impact them. So please, please, please think about that before you even start dating. And if you are dating someone, just be really mindful of that too. And I am so thankful that God healed me in time. And I would probably say that I couldn't have handled a relationship with my husband in the way that I did if it wasn't for God healing me at the time that he did. And me and my husband were not perfect. We definitely probably slipped up at times and maybe crossed certain boundaries that we set. As I mentioned before, we're humans, we mess up, and that's okay. But it's what do you learn from that? And I'm really thankful to say that from the age of 20 all the way through to my wedding night, I did not engage in sexual activity. And that was not easy. And it was challenging. And when I say I didn't engage in sexual activity, I don't mean that I didn't ever cross any boundaries. I mean that I didn't actually have full-on sex. Is kind of what I'm referring to there. And me and my husband definitely managed things in a way that I look back and I'm proud of. We, as I say, we weren't perfect, but we were always put God at the center. And we always were aware that we both had weaknesses. We're humans, and that we both struggled in certain areas, and that we needed to work together with God to work through it. And when I did get married, as I mentioned, I did have baggage still and certain expectations that were really unhealthy, and I had to work through them. And I'm 2.5 years into marriage now, and my view on sex is probably the healthiest that it's ever been. And my view on the way that culture views sex is, I've definitely understood the power of it more now than I did before. And we need to understand the power that the cultural view on sex has, because it's damaging us and it's impacting us. And so what I want to end with is just encouragement that if you're going through anything that I have gone through, any of that temptation, or actively, engaging in sex before marriage, to first of all not beat yourself up, to not put yourself down, to not isolate yourself and think that you're the only one struggling, because clearly you're not, because I did. And I'm sure that as this video gains more audience, that people will hopefully be saying, yeah, me too. Because we need to join in this together and support one another. But I would say that the only way that you can ever truly overcome an addiction is by inviting God into it. Yes, there's steps that you can take, and I obviously shared some last week, but one of the steps that I did share last week is that we need to pray to God. That we can't do this without Him. We can have all the accountability partners that we want. We can have all the right mindsets that we want. But if God's not in it, then we are not going to experience healing from Him. We need to be asking God to heal our hearts, our minds, our souls, to heal every part of our body that is being impacted by our temptation or our addiction. And so please invite God into the situation. Do not ever feel guilty for what you do. Obviously, yes, you want to feel convicted, you want to feel challenged, but never let anyone make you feel like you're inadequate or that you're a bad Christian because of what you struggle with. Because I'm pretty sure that most people would probably admit that they've struggled with something similar at some point in their life. And if they claim they haven't, then either they're some saint or they're lying. And so, we need to be clear that we are all open to temptation, that none of us are exempt. And so inviting God into it from day one is the best way that we can overcome this. And I would say that especially if you're younger, if you're maybe like 18, 19, 20, This is the perfect opportunity to set standards that you can take into your 20s. You know, as you reach adulthood and you start living in more of an adult life, you're going to face so much more challenge and expectations. And so having those standards in place, those boundaries in place at a young age, I think is one of the best ways that you can hopefully beat those temptations. So I really hope this series on sex has been really helpful for you. And the biggest takeaway I want you to really take from this is firstly that God forgives. You are not alone, and that the more time that we spend in God's presence praying to Him, that hopefully the easier it will be to deal with the temptations that life brings. So thank you so much for watching this series. I'm going to be bringing more series in the future about marriage and relationships, as it's a topic that I'm really passionate about. So please like and subscribe and share this video and the other videos on sex with a friend if you feel like they need that support. Again, you know, don't be in it by yourself. Share with other people that you trust and get support. So thanks so much for watching. Have an amazing week, and I will see you next Friday. Bye.